Good morning, good morning. No, it's good day, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name's Carol Richards. I'm a sociologist working in the business school, and this event has been co-hosted by business school and law school. So co-conveners are Matthew Rimmer down in the front, who's going to give you a quick wave, and also Robbie Mays down here from the business school. So thank you all for coming. Before I start, and in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where QUT now stands, recognise that these have always been places of teaching and learning, and we wish to pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as they continue to work within the QUT community. So also we'd like to thank our speakers today. We have 8 speakers in 2 different sessions. What we'll do is listen to the first 4 speakers and then have a break for lunch. And so we'll listen to the speakers together and have a Q&A at the end of each of the panel sessions. Just so the speakers know, we have about a 12-minute slot for their presentations, and Farah here in the white, who's also going to wave to you, is going to give you a 2-minute warning. So once you've spoken for 10 minutes, Farah will wave to you and you've got about 2 minutes left to wrap up. And then that'll give us time for plenty of Q&A at the end, and also some time for lunch, which is also important. As it was pointed out, I work on food security, so I'm really keen to make sure you all eat today. So what we have is a range of presenters working in the areas of social, financial, legal debates. We have speakers from climate change, asylum seeker detention centres who are interested in divestment, and we'll talk to you today about their work. Our first speaker, who I'm going to invite up right now, is James. James works for Future Super, and he's going to talk to you about ethical investment. Please welcome James.
Thank you. So I'm the first speaker. You'll notice that there's no slides. It's all up from there after me, technologically speaking. So I'll just sort of give you that. And what I'd like to do today is just really talk about an overview of ethical investment, because in many respects, a lot of what comes after can be encapsulated within an ethical investment perspective. So from what I'm saying today, they're not necessarily my company's views. Largely they are, but I will say that. And it's probably definitely not the industry views. So I'll give you a bit of perspective that may be a bit unusual. So I'm not going to talk today about how many $1 billion are in funds under management within the ethical investment or responsible investment area, partly because I actually don't know the number right now, and partly because, as I hope to show you, the parameters, the breadth of this area is so diverse that I can't even tell you what is and what isn't an ethical investment in some contexts. So there are many forms of ethical investment. They go by acronyms like SRI, ESG, PRI. They go by terms like ethical investment, responsible investment, values investing, green investment. They take many forms: positive and negative screening, divestment, inclusive finance, community finance, shareholder activism or advocacy, impact investing. So what's the difference between some of these? The 2 major ones, in my view, are ethical investment and ESG. They're probably the dominant forms. Some would say that ethical investment is about values and ESG is about value. Some would say that it's the individual is concerned with ethical investment, and ESG, environmental, social and governance is the term that ESG is what the term ESG is. And some would say that that's about the big end of town and superannuation funds. And some would say that ethical investment is about morals and ESG is about money. Now, I think the last one, that ESG is really about the big end of town, is for me the closest to the truth. And so I'm not sure that that's anything to be proud of. I think that ethical investment can incorporate the financials and the moral questions. And ESG tends to want to talk about the money questions. Although it's interesting that increasingly, particularly in some of the industry superannuation funds and broader superannuation funds, moral questions like detention centres are coming into play, but they're not canvassed in terms of moral questions, they're canvassed in terms of financial problems, reputational risk. And so some of the funds, industry funds, superannuation funds, have removed tobacco or detention centres or climate issues have become their concerns, and they're taken out of the portfolio. Not necessarily because it's doing the right thing, but because there's an argument, there's a reputational risk, there's a health and safety issue, there's a public policy problem. And so it really, in some respects, it really doesn't matter to them whether one smokes and whether they put themselves and others at risk, but there's a question of let's look at the healthcare issues and the health system, and that statement is their goal. And as I said, I have some issues with that very often. I don't think it's an either-or question about this argument. I think, as I was saying, ethical investment, good ethical investment, can take into account both the morals simultaneously with financial consequences. So what does ethical investment cover? Where does it come from, and what's its role? Well, a brief history of ethical investment can take us back to the Quakers and the Methodists of the 1700s and 1800s. And early on, the discussion was pejoratively framed by opponents of ethical investment as simply removing these sin stocks. And those early versions were religious-based, and so the sin stocks were no alcohol, no tobacco, no gambling. That was the story in the beginning. If you want to take a more contemporaneous view of ethical investment, then you can find it in the anti-Vietnam, anti-apartheid movements of the 60s and 70s. If you want to go further than that, then you can look increasingly at what has grown up. But one of the first funds, in America at least, was a fund called PAX, and people much more educated than I would know from their Latin that Pax means peace. And so that was an anti-militarism fund. Today, if you want to keep that evolution going, you can talk about genetically modified foods, you can talk about animal rights, you can talk about a whole range of issues that come to the fore. Climate change is one of those dominant issues that has come to the fore in the last few years, and it's almost become the issue of all issues. And I think that that's partly because of its scale and the ramifications. I mean, it affects not obviously, I'm not saying anything new here, it affects not obviously our generation, but all generations to come. And much like war, covers humanitarian issues, environmental issues, social issues, and geopolitics on an unparalleled scale. So why would you bother with ethical investment, and why would you look at these issues? Well, one way to address some of these issues, and I'm sure many of you might have done so, are petitions and protests to elevate or to identify the public angst. But in a world where money is the collateral of big business, restricting capital can be a really potent force. And it's really interesting that we all have values, and we all, implement our beliefs in different ways, and money is one of those ways. And many people say to me, but I have no money, and it's really out of my ability. But we all increasingly have superannuation funds, and I have had discussions with several activists who have told me, they stand in front of bulldozers to prevent native forests being logged. And I said, and so, do you have any money? No, that's pretty much our life's work. That's what we do. We really have no money. And I said, so no superannuation money? Oh, yes, we have superannuation money, and superannuation money somewhere. And I said, well, that superannuation money is more likely funding those bulldozers that you're risking your life standing in front of. So that's the connection that I think most people just forget. Most people just think my money is doing something in a bank or in a superannuation fund, and I have no control over it, and it really doesn't influence anything of concern to me, but in fact probably has great concern to many of us. And it doesn't make a lot of sense, in my way of thinking, to leave that as a an entity to be doing whatever it does unbeknownst. So what does ethical investment take into account? Well, it has taken into account and can take into account any or all of these and even more, whatever issues we find are important and pertinent at the time. Live exports, gambling, tobacco, coal and oil exploration, GMOs, native forest logging, human rights abuses, child labour, Indigenous rights, pretty much anything you can think of. The other side of the coin is, for me, really important, though, if you're not going to invest in certain things, if you're going to exclude carbon-intensive and climate-unfriendly activities, what are you going to invest in? And from my perspective, that's where Future Super plays a role. So it looks at other areas. Where are we going to have a positive outcome, a positive input? Renewable energy, efficient transport, waste management, energy efficiencies. These are some of the businesses that I would want to be involved in, and some of the businesses that are likely going to change the direction of the way in which we operate in the world. One area I'd just like to briefly touch on, which isn't actually in the necessarily in the investment perspective, is a thing called shareholder advocacy or shareholder activism. I really like this area, and it's one that hasn't really been addressed very much in Australia. It involves putting resolutions to annual general meetings. And a fund that I started a while ago called the Climate Advocacy Fund did that in regard to climate change, and there's a few other people today who are doing things primarily in regard to political donations and also climate change issues. And that's one in using the legal and financial systems that boards operate in, because you put a resolution, focuses the board's mind. There are reputational issues embedded in all of that, but more importantly, it's about in-your-face activism, because the board then has to react in some way to this resolution that has been put, and becomes part of the public agenda and arena. So these so-called non-financial parameters, as they used to be called, were largely dismissed, but today mainstream accounting firms produce papers to inform boards of their fiduciary duties and obligations and how to take such matters into account, to the point where legal opinion now suggests that directors of companies who do not take, for example, the consequences of climate change into their planning activities may be derelict in their duties and legally liable. So that's a multifaceted version of activism. One thing I have to sort of say is, so what about the financial performance of these funds? Because at the end of the day, it's great to have, our superannuation money is going to be what we retire on in our golden years. Inverted commas. And I've got to admit that I'm pretty anxious about discussing this under the broad categorisation, because, as I hope I've alluded to, is ethical investment is not a homogeneous club. It's got many complexions and variants. Some funds allow investment in unacceptable activities like coal mining if the company that they're involved in has a renewable energy division. So it's really important to sort of understand what the ethical investment, responsible investment, green investment is actually doing. So I think ethical investment has two aspects to it. It can provide you with an understanding of the unknown, so to speak, and precautionary principle by not doing the things that could be dangerous and ensuring that we are not going down a wrong path. But I actually think it's actually visionary as well. I think it can look at the future and say, I want to be in this area. And for example, Blackmores is a really interesting example of how it can elevate future growth areas. And Blackmores, as many of us would know, is a domestic company involved in healthcare. It's based on natural medicines with evidence-based benefits as opposed to big pharma. And it's getting benefits from a growing middle class in Asia who are looking to that as well. So it's a company that is doing the right thing, but demographically has a real momentum going, which can take it into the future and grow and be financially viable. Because at the end of the day, as I was saying, these investments that we make on your behalf have to pay off. We do the morals, we do the money, we do both together. So my final sort of 1 minute is that the literature now confirms increasingly that there are comparable returns able to be made in this area of ethical investment, even though the detractors still say and have been saying that that's not necessarily the case. In Future Super's case, the year to 30th of September, so only a month or so ago, their balance fund, which currently is the only fund that we have, was ranked number 1 out of about 100 similar funds in their asset allocation, which just means that it's got a certain amount of growth assets and stable assets. And over the 3 months 6 months, 1 year and 2 year periods, and that's how long we've been going, we've only been going 2 years, we were a top quartile performer. So excluding the big banks and miners didn't seem to hurt performance. In fact, I would argue that in fact aided performance. Though I have to say one thing, past performance is not a reliable indicator of future performance. But I hope that's given you really just a touch on, in terms of overview of what ethical investment is and what it can do and the issues that it can cover. And I know that a number of other speakers will be discussing some of those issues, and so I look forward to having further discussions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, James. That was a really enlightening and very interesting presentation.